In the occupied cities and villages of France, where the shadow war of resistance against Nazi tyranny was fought not in open fields but in back alleys, safe houses, and the terrifying intimacy of Gestapo encounters, a weapon's value was measured by entirely different standards than those applied on conventional battlefields. A rifle was useless when you needed to walk past a German checkpoint with your weapon concealed beneath your coat. A submachine gun could not be hidden in a market basket when you were carrying forged documents to a safe house across Paris. Artillery, tanks, and the grand hardware of conventional warfare were irrelevant in a world where the decisive engagements lasted seconds, where the margin between survival and capture was the fraction of a moment it took to draw a weapon and fire, and where detection of that weapon before you needed it meant arrest, torture, and very possibly death. In this world, the pistol was everything, and the choice of which pistol to carry was a decision that resistance fighters made with the seriousness of people who understood that their lives depended on it. And among the pistols available to the French resistance through the supply operations of Britain's Special Operations Executive, one weapon stood apart, sought after with an intensity that surprised the conventional military officers who had designed the supply programs and who regarded the pistol in question as merely competent rather than exceptional. That weapon was the Browning High Power, manufactured in wartime Canada at the John Inglis Company's Toronto factory, dropped in containers to resistance networks across France, and clutched by men and women who had discovered through the hard school of clandestine warfare that this particular combination of capacity, reliability, concealability, and simplicity was uniquely suited to the desperate requirements of their struggle. This is the story of the Browning High Power in the hands of the French resistance, of why the weapon that soldiers sometimes dismissed as unremarkable became the most coveted sidearm in the Shadow War, and of the extraordinary people who carried it through some of the most dangerous circumstances of the entire conflict. The Browning High Power's genesis was as distinguished as its wartime reputation among conventional forces was occasionally ambivalent. The pistol had been designed by John Moses Browning, the American firearms genius whose inventions had shaped the development of automatic weapons throughout the early 20th century. Browning began work on the design in the 1920s in response to a French military requirement for a new service pistol, and when he died in 1926 before completing the project, the Belgian firm Fabrique Nationale continued the development under the engineer Dieudonné Save, who made significant modifications to Browning's original concept before the pistol reached its final form. The resulting weapon, adopted by Belgium and numerous other nations in the 1930s and designated the Browning High Power or Grande Puissance, was a pistol of genuinely advanced design for its era. Its most immediately striking characteristic was its magazine capacity, 13 rounds of 9mm parabellum cartridge, stacked in a double-column magazine that gave the pistol nearly twice the ammunition capacity of most competing designs. The Luger held 8 rounds, the Walther P38 held 8 rounds, the Colt 1911 held 7 rounds. The Browning High Power held 13, and this single characteristic would prove to be of enormous tactical significance in the specific context of resistance operations, even though it attracted relatively little attention in conventional military assessments. When Germany invaded Belgium in May 1940, the Fabrique Nationale factory in Liège fell into German hands, and the production of the Browning High Power continued under German occupation, with the pistols produced for German military use. This created the extraordinary situation of the same weapon being used by both sides in the conflict, a phenomenon that would have significant practical implications for the resistance fighters, who later captured German-carried high powers and could immediately use them with their own ammunition supply. Meanwhile, Dieudonné Save and other KFN personnel had escaped Belgium before the German occupation, taking with them the technical drawings for the high power, and eventually made their way to Britain. From there, the design was transferred to Canada, where the John Inglis Company in Toronto was contracted to manufacture the high power for Allied forces. The Inglis high power, as it became known, was produced in substantial numbers from 1944 onward, equipping British and Commonwealth forces Chinese nationalist forces, and crucially, providing a supply of weapons for the clandestine networks of occupied Europe. The conventional military assessment of the high power, as issued to British and Commonwealth forces, was competent but rarely enthusiastic. The weapon was acknowledged as reliable, reasonably accurate and mechanically sound, but it occupied an awkward position in the British military's weapon inventory. The standard British sidearm remained the Enfield revolver for much of the war, and the high power was issued primarily to specialist units, airborne forces, and the various clandestine services rather than becoming the universal sidearm of the British officer class. Among conventional infantry officers who were accustomed to thinking of sidearms as secondary weapons of last resort, the high power's particular virtues were not immediately apparent. Its double-column magazine, which gave it the 13-round capacity that would prove so valuable in other contexts, also made the grip somewhat wider than those of single-column magazine pistols, and some officers complained that it was less comfortable in the hand than alternatives. The magazine disconnector, a safety feature that prevented the pistol from firing when the magazine was removed, was criticised by some experienced pistol shooters who felt it complicated certain tactical situations. The weapon's single-action trigger, which required the external hammer to be cocked before the first shot could be fired in single-action mode, demanded either that the pistol be carried with the hammer cocked and safety applied, a condition that made some soldiers uncomfortable, or that the first shot be fired by manually cocking the hammer, adding a step to the draw and fire sequence. These criticisms were not entirely without merit in the context of conventional military use, where the weapon was being compared against alternatives on the basis of criteria relevant to open battlefield combat. But they missed almost entirely the qualities that made the high power exceptional for the very different requirements of clandestine operations, and it was in this context that the weapon's true character emerged with unmistakable clarity. The French resistance fighters and SOE agents who encountered the high power in operational conditions quickly developed an appreciation for the weapon that went far beyond what conventional military assessments had suggested was warranted. The most immediately significant quality was the magazine capacity. 13 rounds of 9mm in a single magazine was not merely a modest improvement over the 8 rounds of the Luger or the 6 rounds of the Enfield revolver. It was a qualitative change in the tactical situation of anyone carrying the weapon. For a resistance fighter who might need to engage multiple opponents simultaneously, who could not count on the support of comrades in the way that conventional soldiers could, and who had no opportunity to reload in the middle of an engagement without exposing themselves to fatal risk, the difference between 6 or 8 shots and 13 was potentially the difference between survival and death. Consider the specific scenarios that resistance fighters actually faced. A roadblock where 3 or 4 German soldiers demanded to see papers, the papers failed to convince, and within seconds the situation escalated to violence. An ambush of a collaborator who turned out to be accompanied by 2 bodyguards, rather than travelling alone as expected. A safe house compromised by informers, with Gestapo agents arriving in force, while the occupants attempted to fight their way out. In each of these situations, the number of rounds available before reloading was critical, and the high power's 13-round capacity provided a margin that could make the critical difference. The 9mm parabellum cartridge that the high power chambered was the most widely distributed pistol cartridge in the German military, used in the Luger, the Walther P38, the MP38, and MP40 submachine guns, and numerous other weapons. This commonality of ammunition was of enormous practical importance for resistance fighters, who could not rely on regular supply of specific ammunition types, and who frequently operated in situations where replenishing their own supply was impossible. A resistance fighter carrying a high power could use ammunition captured from German soldiers, stripped from the magazines of captured German weapons, or taken from German supply stocks during sabotage operations. This ammunition flexibility dramatically increased the practical sustainability of the weapon in the specific supply conditions of occupied France, where British supply drops were irregular, unpredictable, and frequently inadequate for operational needs. The delivery of Browning high powers and other weapons to the French resistance was conducted primarily through Special Operations Executive Supply operations, using modified Royal Air Force aircraft to drop containers of weapons, ammunition, explosives, and other equipment to designated reception committees in remote rural areas of France. The supply drops were dangerous and uncertain operations at every stage. The aircraft crews flew at low altitude over occupied France in darkness, navigating to prearranged coordinates and releasing their containers in response to signal fires or lights arranged by the Resistance Reception Committee on the ground below. The Reception Committee, typically consisting of a dozen or more people who'd been briefed on the drop's timing and location through coded BBC radio messages, would collect the containers from fields and forests, hide them from German patrols, and distribute their contents to operational cells through clandestine courier networks. The weapons that arrived in these containers were typically packed in grease for protection against moisture and the physical shock of the drop, wrapped in waxed paper or packed in oilskin bags, and stored in cylindrical metal containers that could be buried or hidden in barns and outbuildings. A resistance fighter receiving a high power from a supply drop would often be handling a firearm for the first time in their life, with no formal training in its operation and no opportunity to practice before they might need to use it in earnest. This reality placed a premium on simplicity of operation, a weapon whose operating principles could be explained and understood in minutes, that could be loaded and fired by someone who had never fired a pistol before, and that would function reliably even if its new owner's maintenance techniques were imperfect. The high power met these requirements remarkably well. Its operating principle was straightforward: load the magazine, insert it into the grip, rack the slide to chamber the first round, apply the safety if desired, and the weapon was ready to fire. Subsequent shots required nothing more than pulling the trigger. The single-action trigger, though criticised by some experienced shooters for requiring the hammer to be cocked for the first shot, was actually an advantage for inexperienced users because its light, short pull made accurate shooting easier than the long, heavy pull of a double-action revolver or double-action pistol. A person who had received a few minutes of instruction on the high powers operation could achieve adequate combat accuracy at close range more quickly than with most alternative designs. The physical dimensions of the high power were also well suited to clandestine use. The pistol was relatively compact and flat by the standards of 13-round capacity pistols, a consequence of the double-stack magazine design that placed cartridges in a staggered column, requiring less grip length than a single-stack magazine of the same capacity. The weapon could be concealed under clothing more easily than many alternatives, carried in a shoulder holster beneath a coat, in a specially modified briefcase or bag, or in a holster worn in the small of the back. SOE agents who carried the high power in occupied France reported that with appropriate clothing, the weapon could be carried all day in urban environments without creating the telltale bulge or awkwardness that might attract attention from German soldiers or French collaborators. The specific tactical situations in which resistance fighters employed the high power reflected the particular character of clandestine warfare in occupied France. Assassinations of German officers and collaborators were among the most significant operations the resistance conducted, both for their direct effect in eliminating specific individuals and for their psychological impact on the occupation apparatus. These operations typically required approaching the target in a civilian environment, engaging at close range when the opportunity presented itself, and then escaping before the inevitable German response could be organised. The high power's combination of concealability, adequate power, and 13-round capacity made it well suited to these operations. An agent who missed with the first shot, or whose target proved to be accompanied by unexpected bodyguards, had the ammunition reserved to continue the engagement and potentially still complete the mission and escape. The liberation of France following the D-Day landings in June 1944 created a new context for high-power operations as the resistance transformed from a clandestine network into a more openly fighting force. In the weeks and months following D-Day, resistance units across France emerged from the shadows to conduct open military operations against German forces and communications. They ambushed supply convoys, attacked isolated German positions, disrupted rail lines, and fought alongside the advancing Allied forces as the liberation progressed. In these operations, the high power's qualities were tested in a context closer to conventional military combat, and the weapon continued to perform well. The 13-round magazine allowed resistance fighters with limited military training to sustain fire in ambush situations, where trained soldiers might have managed their ammunition more efficiently. The weapon's reliability meant that resistance units which lacked the equipment and expertise for regular maintenance could still count on their high powers functioning when needed. One of the most dramatic contexts for high-power use during the liberation period was the urban fighting that accompanied the liberation of Paris in August 1944. As German forces attempted to maintain control of the city against a combination of Allied advance and internal uprising, resistance fighters armed with weapons from years of supply drops fought street by street through the familiar terrain of their city. In these close-quarters urban engagements, the high power's capacity and reliability were directly tested against German forces carrying their own pistols and submachine guns. Accounts from participants in the Paris fighting consistently note the importance of magazine capacity in situations where multiple opponents had to be engaged in rapid succession across narrow streets and through doorways, and the high power's 13 rounds provided the ammunition reserve that these situations demanded. The AOE agents who carried high powers in France and trained resistance networks in their use developed a deep practical knowledge of the weapon's capabilities and limitations that went well beyond the theoretical assessments of conventional military evaluators. These agents, operating under cover identities in constant danger of arrest and execution, had the most direct possible interest in understanding exactly what their weapons could and could not do. Their assessments, recorded in operational reports and personal memoirs, are consistently positive about the high power's performance in clandestine operations, and provide some of the most valuable evidence for understanding why the weapon was so highly regarded by resistance fighters. One SOE agent operating in the Lyon area reported that she had carried a high power for 14 months of continuous operations, during which period the weapon had been subjected to extended periods without proper cleaning, exposure to rain and damp in outdoor caches, and the inevitable rough handling of active operations. Throughout this period, the weapon had functioned reliably whenever she had needed to draw it, which on several occasions had been in confrontations with German soldiers or milice, the French collaborationist police, where the weapon's presence and her evident willingness to use it had allowed her to avoid what would otherwise have been fatal arrests. She noted specifically that the 13-round magazine had been important in her calculations during these confrontations. Facing multiple opponents, she had felt that the weapon gave her sufficient rounds to engage all of them if necessary, a confidence that she believed had contributed to the decisive manner with which she had handled these situations. The psychological dimension of carrying the high power in occupied France deserves particular emphasis, because the psychological reality of clandestine warfare was as important as the physical reality in determining outcomes. An agent or resistance fighter who was uncertain about their weapon, who worried about whether it would function reliably, who was conscious of having only 6 or 7 rounds before needing to reload, was an agent whose attention was divided between the operational task and their anxiety about their weapon. The high power's reliability and capacity addressed both of these sources of anxiety, allowing its carrier to direct their full concentration to the operational task rather than allocating mental energy to concern about their weapon. This psychological contribution to operational effectiveness was impossible to quantify, but was recognized consistently by those who experienced it. The irony of the high power's situation in the resistance context was that many of the weapon's qualities that made it valuable in clandestine operations were the same qualities that conventional military assessments had treated as relatively unimportant or even slightly negative. The 13-round capacity, dismissed by some conventional officers as more than was needed, was for resistance fighters a margin between life and death, in situations where help would not arrive. The 9mm chambering, identical to the most common German pistol cartridge, which had no particular significance in the British military supply system, made the weapon independently sustainable in an environment where supply was unreliable. The single-action trigger, criticised by some for requiring the hammer to be cocked for the first shot, was by the same token easier to shoot accurately for the many resistance fighters who had minimal training, its light pull compensating for the lack of formal marksmanship education. The high power's interaction with the broader equipment ecosystem of the resistance also enhanced its practical value in ways that isolated weapon assessments could not capture. SOE supply drops typically included not just weapons but ammunition, explosives, radio equipment, and other operational supplies. The 9mm high-power ammunition could be packaged and transported by the same methods used for other small arms ammunition in the supply drops, required no special handling, and could be shared among fighters carrying different 9mm weapons, including captured German submachine guns. This interoperability within the Resistance's diverse weapon inventory reduced the logistical complexity of supplying and sustaining clandestine networks, a genuine practical advantage in an environment where logistical complexity imposed real operational costs. The comparative performance of the high power against the German weapons that resistance fighters most frequently encountered in combat illustrates the weapon's specific advantages clearly. German soldiers in France typically carried the Walter P38, or the Luger, as their standard sidearm, supplemented in many units by various submachine guns. In close-quarters encounters where resistance fighters engaged German soldiers with pistols, the high power's 13-round magazine provided a decisive advantage over the 8 rounds available from German pistols. In several documented engagements, resistance fighters who survived to give accounts specifically noted that having additional rounds available had allowed them to continue engaging opponents after their German adversaries' weapons were empty, reversing what had appeared to be an unfavourable tactical situation. The reliability comparison was equally significant. German pistols, particularly the Luger, were known to be sensitive to ammunition quality and environmental conditions, and the ammunition captured from German sources and used in resistance high powers was sometimes of varying quality from different production batches or had been stored in less than ideal conditions. The high power's design was more tolerant of ammunition variations than the Luger's precisely matched tolerances demanded, meaning that resistance fighters using captured German 9mm ammunition in their high powers typically experienced fewer malfunctions than German soldiers using the same ammunition in their Lugers. This reliability advantage in the specific ammunition conditions of resistance operations was a genuine tactical advantage that no pre-war specification comparison could have predicted. The training that SOE provided for high-power use reflected the specific operational context of clandestine work, rather than the marksmanship and tactical doctrine of conventional military training. SOE's training programs, conducted at establishments in the English countryside where agents were prepared for their missions, emphasize close-range shooting, drawing and firing rapidly from concealment, engaging multiple targets, and the psychological preparation for using lethal force in the close and personal circumstances of resistance work. The high power was well suited to all of these training objectives. Its light single-action trigger facilitated the rapid, accurate fire that close-range combat demanded. Its capacity allowed training scenarios involving multiple targets without magazine changes. Its reliability during training built the confidence in the weapon that agents would need when they deployed to France. One aspect of the high power's clandestine suitability that is rarely discussed in conventional military assessments is what might be called its social invisibility, its ability to be carried and transported in civilian environments without attracting attention. Unlike the longer-barreled pistols and revolvers that were more obviously weapons to an observant eye, the high power's relatively compact dimensions allowed it to be holstered in positions and under clothing that minimized visual detection risk. SOE tailors and equipment specialists developed specific clothing modifications, including specially cut jacket linings and modified trouser waistbands that allowed the high power to be carried concealed in ways that would pass casual inspection and even more careful observation unless the observer was specifically trained to look for concealed weapons. This wearability in civilian environments was a practical operational requirement that weapon specifications never addressed, but that determined much of the weapon's utility in the Shadow War. The post-liberation period in France provided an unexpected coda to the high power's resistance career. As France was liberated and the resistance transformed into the nascent French military forces that would join the final Allied push into Germany, many resistance fighters who had carried high powers throughout their clandestine careers sought to retain the weapon that had seen them through the occupation. The French forces that were reconstituted after liberation adopted the high power as their standard service pistol, a direct reflection of the weapon's positive reputation among the men and women who had used it in the most demanding circumstances the war had produced. This adoption was not just institutional conservatism or administrative convenience, but a genuine expression of the respect that experienced fighters had developed for the weapon through years of operational use. The global legacy of the Browning high power, extending from its wartime service through to the 21st century, reflects the enduring validity of the design principles that made it valuable to the French resistance. The weapon was adopted by more than 50 nations' armed forces over the course of its production history, a record exceeded by very few other pistol designs. It remained in production for decades and in active service with numerous military forces into the 1990s and beyond. The qualities that resistance fighters valued, its reliability, its capacity, its ease of use, and its adaptability to different operational contexts, proved equally valuable to conventional military forces as the specific operational circumstances that had made them most apparent in clandestine warfare were recognized as important for open military use as well. The story of the Browning high power among the French resistance is ultimately a story about the gap between theoretical assessment and operational reality, about how weapons that appear merely competent in controlled evaluations can reveal extraordinary qualities when the full complexity of their intended operational environment is experienced. The conventional military officers who assessed the high power against other pistols on the basis of trigger feel, grip comfort, and marginal differences in accuracy were not wrong in their observations. The resistance fighters who carried the weapon through years of clandestine operations and who valued it above every other available pistol were not wrong either. They were measuring different things in different contexts against different criteria. The officers were measuring the weapon's performance in the conditions they knew. The resistance fighters were measuring it in the conditions they actually faced, and in those conditions the high power's combination of capacity, reliability, concealability, and independence from supply chains revealed a weapon of exceptional operational value. For the men and women of the French resistance who carried the Browning high power through the occupation, the weapon was not a piece of military equipment to be assessed against specifications. It was a companion in the most dangerous circumstances of their lives, a tool that they had learned to trust because their survival had repeatedly depended on it. When the liberation came and the occupation ended and the Shadow War became history, many of them kept their high powers, unwilling to surrender the weapon that had seen them through. In that reluctance lay the most eloquent possible tribute to a pistol that conventional assessments had sometimes treated as unremarkable, the testimony of the people who had trusted it with their lives and who wanted to keep it close, even after the need had passed. The Browning high power had earned that trust in the hardest possible school, and it had not been found wanting.